President Mozambique, Your Excellency Colonel Michael Randarinariana, President Madagascar, Your Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General, United Nations, Your Excellency Aziz Akunoj, Prime Minister Morocco, Your Excellency Russell Mino Dlami, Prime Minister Eswatini, Your Excellency Americo D'Olivier dos Ramos, Prime Minister Sao Tome, Your Excellency Serazafan Zefri, Prime Minister Tunisia, Your Excellency Mwigulu Lameck Nchemba, Prime Minister Tanzania, all Vice Presidents present, Your Excellency Ambassadors, Heads of Delegation, Country Representative, Development Partners, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Your Excellencies, at this point where we see Africa moving forward, it is a day that will be marked in history as a change has begun. Allow me, Your Excellencies, at this point to invite Vivian Onano, who is going to be our moderator for this session. Vivian Onano is one who needs no introduction. She's an award-winning journalist and also has many other things that she has achieved in her accolades. Let's put our hands together as we welcome Vivian Onano, our moderator this morning. A good clap for her, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mike Gitonga, for the kind introduction. Excellencies, heads of states and governments, distinguished ministers, captains of industry, members of the diplomatic corps, fellow young leaders, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Bonjour, bon dia, salam alaikum. Welcome to the Africa Forward Summit 2026 under the theme Africa-France Partnerships for Innovation and Growth. It is my distinct honor and privilege to serve as the moderator for this presidential opening session. Please allow me to begin by expressing sincere appreciation to our co-host, Son Excellence, Monsieur Emmanuel Macron, President de la République Française, Son Excellence, Dr. William Samoei Ruto, President de la République du Kenya. Please join me in giving their excellencies a warm round of applause for their leadership and commitment to strengthening a renewed Africa-France partnership grounded in mutual respect, mutual cooperation, and shared prosperity. A big round of applause to their excellencies. Excellencies, we gather here today at a defining moment in global history. The world is resetting, and increasingly, Africa is becoming central to what comes next. Today, Africa is the youngest continent on Earth, with a median age of just 19 years. By 2050, 1 in 4 people in the world will be African. This is not simply a demographic reality. It is one of the greatest economic opportunities of our time, if properly invested in. Otherwise, it also risks becoming a major liability. Because when we speak about Africa Forward, we are fundamentally speaking about our young people. Young Africans are already driving transformation across this continent, and this was clearly demonstrated yesterday at the Youth Future Makers Forum, where both President Macron and President Ruto actively engage with young leaders and entrepreneurs. And with greater investment in education, innovation, entrepreneurship, Africa has the potential to become one of the defining economic growth stories of the 21st century. Excellencies, how do we go from the amazing potential that we have to where we need to be at unprecedented scale and speed? Excellencies, as a young Kenyan, as someone privileged to have studied at Sciences Po Paris, and as someone who has had the opportunity to travel across more than 40 countries in Africa and continues to actively engage with young people and leaders from both Africa and Europe, I genuinely believe that this moment matters deeply for Africa, for France, and for the future of international cooperation itself. Because this summit represents possibility. The possibility of moving beyond old assumptions and building partnerships based on co-creation, co-investments, innovation, trust, and shared growth. This is strategic partnership. Africa today is experiencing one of the fastest rates of urbanization in human history, yet without a commensurate pace of industrialization. Historically, countries such as France achieved sustained prosperity through the combination of demographic growth, urbanization, and industrial transformation. Africa has the demographic dynamism, urban momentum, and now we need to accelerate the rate of industrialization at the required scale to meet the continent's extraordinary potential today and for the future. Ultimately, the Africa Forward Summit will not be measured simply by speeches and declarations, but by delivery, by investments unlocked at scale, by industries built at scale, by opportunities created at scale, because Africa Forward is not simply a slogan. It must become a commitment to build an Africa that works for its young people, an Africa that competes globally, an Africa that industrializes sustainably, and an Africa that helps shape the future of our world. This is the Africa we want. Excellencies, as I welcome our distinguished leaders to come and deliver their official statements, it would be great to reflect on a number of defining questions. What model of growth will define Africa's future prosperity? How can Africa industrialize at scale in ways that are more sustainable, more inclusive, and more competitive? How do you ensure that the partnership between Africa and France is truly equitable, future-oriented, and capable of delivering shared prosperity in an increasingly complex and competitive world? Excellency, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is now my distinct honor to welcome to the stage our first speaker, who is our gracious host and co-convener. He is a champion for African economic transformation, an increasingly influential voice in shaping Africa's place in the world, and is very committed to positioning Africa not at the margins of the global economy, but at the very center of its future. Please welcome to the stage His Excellency Dr. William Samoei Ruto, President of the Republic of Kenya. Karibu, Mr. President. Thank you so much, Mr. President.
Thank you. Your Excellency Emmanuel Macron, President of the French Republic and co-chair of the Africa Forward Summit 2026. Excellencies, heads of state and government, honorable ministers, captains of industry, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It is a profound honor and privilege to welcome you to the Africa Forward Summit 2026 here in Nairobi, Kenya, the cradle of humankind, the birthplace of our shared human history, and the origin of wonder. Wherever you come from, you are not merely visiting. You are returning to the very beginnings of humanity. And so, with warmth, friendship, and pride, I say to you all, welcome home. Bienvenue chez vous, karibuni nyumbani. We gather, ladies and gentlemen, at a profound, consequential moment in global affairs. The foundations of international order are being reshaped by deepening geopolitical divisions, persistent conflicts, economic volatility, climate pressures, and widening inequalities. Long-standing assumptions about global stability, cooperation, and prosperity are being tested as never before. At the same time, shifting centers of influence changing trade alignments, and the reconfiguration of global supply chains are redefining the architecture of the world economy itself. Yet, in moments such as this, fragmentation cannot be the answer, nor isolation the strategy. The times before us demand stronger cooperation, renewed multilateralism, and partnerships grounded not on hierarchy, but in sovereign equality, mutual respect, and shared responsibility. It is not how we do it. It is in that spirit that we convene this summit, grounded in our shared conviction that enduring partnerships must not be built on dependency, but on sovereign equality, not on aid or charity, but on mutually beneficial investments, and not on extraction or exploitation, but on win-win engagements. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Africa and France have a unique opportunity to forge a forward-looking partnership that delivers shared progress while advancing Africa's long-term economic transformation. Africa approaches this summit not from the margins of global affairs, but as a strategic actor in its own right, endowed with vast natural resources, expanding markets, and one of the greatest reservoirs of youthful talent and innovation anywhere in the world today. We all know by the year 2050, 1 in every 4 people on earth will be African. That reality alone will shape the future of labor, will shape the future of markets, urbanization, energy demand, and global economic growth. Over the course of this summit, our deliberations will focus on priorities fundamental to Africa's development trajectory and long-term prosperity. Among them, domestic mobilization of resources for Africa's development at scale, reforms of the international financial architecture, development of transport, logistics, and connectivity infrastructure, energy transition and green industrialization, and of course, youth skills development to foster creativity, innovation, entrepreneurship, and AI-driven transformation. First, we must confront with honesty and urgency the question of how Africa finances its own transformation. The era in which Africa's development was principally framed through aid, dependency, and unsustainable borrowing must give way to a new paradigm grounded in investment, innovation, domestic resource mobilization, and strategic partnerships built on sovereign equality and mutual benefit. Because Africa is not part of the global problem, Africa is in fact the solution to the global challenges that exist today, including those of Africa. Our continent possesses vast natural resources, critical minerals, fertile land, immense renewable energy potential, expanding consumer markets, dynamic entrepreneurs, and the youngest population in the world. What Africa requires today, friends, is not charity, but investments, not extraction, but value creation, not dependency, but mutually beneficial partnerships capable of unlocking shared prosperity. That is the essence of the Africa Forward Summit. It is about recalibrating Africa's place in the global order. It is about redefining engagements with Africa, including with long-standing partners such as France, away from outdated models of aid and asymmetrical dependency towards a framework anchored on investment, enterprise, innovation, industrialization, and mutually beneficial cooperation. And we are very clear about this. The current international financial system remains structurally unequal. African countries continue to face disproportionately high borrowing costs, constrained access to concessional financing, and distorted risk perceptions that are frequently disconnected from economic realities that exist in this continent. The bias embedded within global credit rating systems continue to penalize African economies, increase the cost of capital, and discourage long-term investment into productive sectors. This imbalance is neither sustainable nor just. It is one of the principal constraints on Africa's ability to finance infrastructure, industrialization, climate adaptation, and economic transformation at the scale that is required. That is why Africa has supported the establishment of the African Credit Rating Agency, an important step towards ensuring fairer, evidence-based, and context-sensitive assessment of African economies and investment opportunities. Its purpose is not to replace existing global institutions, but to correct long-standing distortions in risk perception that continue to increase the cost of capital for African countries and continue to discourage long-term investment into productive sectors. At the same time, we must recognize that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund alone cannot finance Africa's development ambition. We have to be realistic. Even as reform efforts continue, the scale of Africa's transformation requires us to rethink the sources, structures, and instruments of development finance itself. Africa must increasingly finance Africa. Let me repeat that. Africa must increasingly finance Africa. What do I mean? Across our continent, enormous pools of domestic capital remain underutilized. Africa today holds more than $4 trillion in long-term domestic savings, including over $1 trillion in pensions and insurance assets, and more than $500 billion in central bank reserves. I am not talking about Europe, I'm talking about Africa. Yet, paradoxically, while this capital exists within African economies, governments across our continent continue to struggle to finance critical infrastructure, transport corridors, energy systems, industrial parks, logistics networks, and even affordable housing. There is capital in Africa, but Africa's development projects remain starved of financing. The issue, therefore, is not liquidity. It is risk architecture. That is why Africa is laying the foundation of a stronger, more resilient, and more self-sustaining financial architecture. Kenya, therefore, reaffirms its very strong support for the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions as a strategic platform for coordinating capital mobilization, risk sharing, and project execution across our continent. You remember, colleagues, that we did endorse at the last AU summit the Alliance of African Multilateral Institutions, starting with the World Bank and all the other institutions. Through institutions such as the Africa Development Bank, Africa Export-Import Bank or Afrexim Bank, Africa Finance Corporation, the Trade and Development Bank, Shelter Afrique Development Bank, Africa 50, and Africa Trade and Investment Development Insurance, Africa is steadily strengthening its capacity to finance infrastructure, industrialization, trade, housing, climate resilience, and economic transformation. These institutions are more than financial intermediaries. They are instruments of African agency, strategic sovereignty, and collective self-determination. Friends, we must believe in ourselves. That is why we strongly support the recapitalization of African Trade and Investment Development Insurance as a critical pillar of the new Africa Financial Architecture for Development. And I must thank the President of the Africa Development Bank, who is right here with us, for spearheading this effort together with all the other multilateral institutions. This is because Africa does not need more fragmented institutions. Africa needs coordinated financial firepower capable of financing infrastructure, industrialization, trade corridors, and energy transformation in our continent on our terms. It is in this spirit that the proposed new Africa Financial Architecture and Development Framework, NAFAD, as we are calling it, seeks to align African multilateral institutions, sovereign investment platforms, pension systems, development banks, and private capital behind a coordinated continental investment strategy. Its objective is simple but transformative: to retain more African savings within Africa and channel them into productive, bankable, and transformative sectors of our economy. NAFAD is designed to unlock long-term domestic institutional capital by creating credible project pipelines, harmonizing investment frameworks, strengthening regional capital markets, and establishing mechanisms that de-risk strategic public investments. By lowering risk and risk perception and improving project preparation, African pensions and insurance funds will be better positioned to invest confidently in infrastructure, industrialization, energy, housing, and regional connectivity projects across our continent. And by the way, I am still talking about resources that are African, our own resources. Ultimately, NAFAD represents Africa's collective effort to build financial sovereignty by aligning African institutions, African savings, and African capital markets behind Africa's development priorities. And Kenya has already begun implementing the elements of this vision through the establishment of the National Infrastructure Fund, a platform designed to mobilize long-term domestic capital into strategic national projects. Already, our new National Infrastructure Fund has mobilized approximately $1 billion in the last 4 months, demonstrating the enormous potential that exists within African economies themselves. And this is money we have just mobilized here in Kenya. As government, we are deliberately partnering with the private sector to build confidence, reduce risk, and crowd in investment into transformative public infrastructure. Our objective is simple: to create credible mechanisms through which private capital can participate securely and profitably in Africa's growth story. Kenya's experience demonstrates what domestic resource mobilization can achieve. Over the last 3.5 years, we have mobilized nearly $4 billion locally for our affordable housing program. Through innovative domestic financing mechanisms, we are investing in housing, creating jobs, supporting enterprise, and expanding home ownership while restoring dignity to millions of Kenyan citizens. This experience demonstrates a fundamental truth. Africa can generate substantial development resources internally when institutions are strong, policies are credible and predictable, markets are trusted, and citizens themselves become active participants in nation building. Excellencies, infrastructure development remains one of the most decisive foundations of Africa's economic transformation and continental integration. Africa's infrastructure financing gap continues to constrain productivity, continues to increase the cost of trade, weaken industrial competitiveness, and fragment markets across our continent. According to the Africa Development Bank, Africa requires between $130 and $170 billion annually for infrastructure investment, with financing gaps estimated at between $70 and $100 billion every year. Bridging this gap will not happen through public borrowing alone. It requires innovative financial instruments, blended finance mechanisms, de-risking facilities like the one I have talked about, and strong public-private partnership capable of unlocking institutional capital at scale. But the broader challenge before us is continental. We must accelerate investment in transport corridors, in ports, rail systems, roads, aviation connectivity, and integrated logistics ecosystems capable of binding Africa together into one competitive economic space under the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Because Africa cannot trade effectively with itself while its economies remain disconnected from one another. Connectivity is not merely about infrastructure. It is about competitiveness. It is about regional value chains. It is about food security, and it's about industrialization. And ultimately, it is about shared prosperity. Equally critical is the question of energy. That is why we must fundamentally restructure and strengthen Africa's financial architecture to mobilize the scale of capital required to finance this transformation on African terms. Excellencies, Africa possesses some of the greatest renewable energy potential anywhere in the world, from geothermal resources in the Rift Valley and on to immense opportunities in solar, wind, hydroelectric power, and green hydrogen across our continent. Africa, therefore, has a historic opportunity, not merely to participate in the global energy transition, but to help lead it. But for Africa, the energy transition must also be a development and an industrialization transition. We must accept a future, and we cannot, let me repeat that, we cannot accept a future in which Africa simply exports raw green minerals, while industrial value addition, advanced manufacturing, and technological innovation take place elsewhere. That model belongs to the past. Africa must become a competitively industrial hub powered by clean energy, modern infrastructure, innovation, and strategic investment partnerships. Green industrialization presents our continent with an opportunity not only to contribute meaningfully to global climate solutions, but also to create jobs, expand manufacturing capacity, strengthen exports, deepen regional value chains, and accelerate structural economic transformation. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps Africa's greatest strategic asset is its people. This demographic and the demographic reality that it presents will profoundly shape the future of labor markets, the future of technology, urbanization, consumption, innovation, and of course, economic growth. Our youth population is not a burden to be managed. It is an extraordinary strategic advantage to be invested in. But demographic potential does not automatically become demographic power. It must be deliberately cultivated by education, skills development, research, digital inclusion, entrepreneurship, and technological innovation. We must equip Africa's young people, not merely to seek jobs, but to create enterprise, build technologies, drive industrial transformation, and lead the next frontier of artificial intelligence and digital innovation. And across our continent, this transformation is already underway. From Nairobi to Lagos, from Kigali to Cape Town, young Africans are redefining finance through fintech, transforming agriculture through technology, expanding digital commerce, building globally competitive startups, and creating solutions capable of shaping industries far beyond our borders. What they require is access. Access to quality education, access to digital infrastructure, access to affordable capital, access to markets, and of course, they will create the opportunities necessary. Ladies and gentlemen, none of these ambitions can be fully realized without peace, stability, and effective multilateral cooperation. Peace, security, and development remain inseparable foundations of sustainable progress. Yet across parts of Africa and beyond, protracted conflicts, violent extremism, unconstitutional changes of government, terrorism, organized crime, and climate-related insecurity continue to undermine stability, weaken institutions, and constrain economic advancement. Current estimates indicate that Africa accounts for nearly 40% of active armed conflict globally and close to half of all internal displacements worldwide. These figures underscore both the scale but also the urgency of the challenges confronting our continent. We must therefore reaffirm our collective support for African-led peace and security mechanisms, including the Africa Union Peace and Security Architecture, predictable financing, institutional capacity, and international cooperation in support of lasting peace. But lasting peace cannot be secured through military response alone. Peace requires confronting the structural drivers of instability: poverty, exclusion, unemployment, inequality, weak institutions, climate vulnerability, and the absence of economic opportunity, particularly for young people. That is why strengthening Africa's strategic autonomy in matters of peace and security remains an imperative. And it is why we reiterate with clarity and conviction the urgent necessity of reforming global peace and security governance, particularly the United Nations Security Council. It is both indispensable and unconscionable that a continent of nearly 1.5 billion people, represented by 54 sovereign states and constituting one of the largest blocs within the United Nations, continues to remain excluded from permanent representation on the Security Council. Such inequality, ladies and gentlemen, such inequality erodes legitimacy, undermines credibility, and diminishes confidence in multilateral systems itself. No global governance architecture can credibly claim to be democratic, to be representative, to be just, or fit for purpose, while a substantial part of humanity remains absent from the table where the world's most consequential decisions are made. The time has come, therefore, for the international community to recognize, without ambiguity or without delay, that Africa cannot and will not and must not remain subject to decisions taken without its equal voice on the table. The reform of the Security Council is not merely an institutional adjustment. It is a moral obligation. It is a strategic necessity. It is indispensable to restoring trust, legitimacy, and confidence in the international order itself. Kenya, therefore, remains steadfast in its support for the common African position as articulated in the Ezulwini Consensus and the Sita Declaration, which calls for Africa to be accorded permanent representation on the Security Council with all the prerogatives and privileges of permanent membership, alongside additional non-permanent seats. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Africa does not need privilege, but fairness. We don't need exclusion, but inclusion. We do not seek confrontation, but partnership anchored on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and of course, shared progress. This summit, therefore, presents us with an opportunity to define a new era of engagement between Africa and its partners, an era based not on dependency, but on dignity, not on extraction, but on value creation, and not on short-term transactions, but on long-term shared prosperity. Because the Africa we envision is an Africa of confidence, an Africa of ideas, an Africa of innovation, an Africa of enterprise, an Africa that believes in itself, invests in its people, mobilizes its own resources, and engages the world as an equal partner in shaping balanced, prosperous, and peaceful global future. Africa is rising, determined to shape its own destiny, and increasingly prepared to shape the future of the world itself. That is the Africa Forward agenda. An agenda grounded not on dependency, but in sovereignty. Not in vulnerability, but in resilience. And not in limitation, but in possibility. That is the Africa whose time has come. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Kenya is deeply honored to co-host this summit here in Nairobi. We look forward to productive deliberations, practical outcomes, and enduring partnerships capable of advancing prosperity, stability, dignity, and shared progress for our people and for future generations. I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for the warm welcome and for reinforcing Africa's economic position today and the importance of partnerships such as the Africa-France partnership. Asante sana, Your Excellency. And now it's my profound honor to welcome to the stage our next speaker, who is also our co-convener. He's a global leader who has consistently championed international cooperation and a world of rules-based order. has been at the forefront of advancing dialogue on global economic reform and strategic partnerships between Africa and France. Please welcome to the stage His Excellency Mr. Emmanuel Macron, President of the Republic of France. Bienvenue, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you so much. Mr. President, dear William, Your Majesty, Head of States and Governments, Secretary General of Permanent Commission of the African Union, Secretary General of Francophonie, Ministers, Ambassadors, Entrepreneurs, ladies and gentlemen, Asante Sana, Mr. President. And I will switch in French, if you allow me. Le président a tout dit. Et donc, je vais juste rajouter quelques convictions pour qu'ensuite on puisse passer à nos travaux. C'est un nouveau type de sommet, c'est une nouvelle philosophie, et donc nous allons aller au bout de cette philosophie. D'abord, ce sommet a commencé par des rencontres de la jeunesse, des entreprises, de la culture, du sport. Et d'ailleurs, nous allons juste après
with the captains of industry with whom we'll be able to discuss things. But deep down, the conviction that I wanted to share with you is that the agenda that Africa and France need to have, the one that I stand for, must not look backwards, but just look straight ahead. As President Ruto just said, we need to keep our eyes ahead. And what I have been trying to do for 10 years now is to construct a relationship which looks backwards with lucidity, and we've been working with Cameroon, Rwanda, Algeria, and several other nations, and with which looks with bravery at the present, looking at our necessity of culture, activity, looking at co-development and co-investment, and which is built on respect for the fact that Africa has its own agenda. The relations between Africa and France, as we see it, as the way we want to implement, are built on courage, respect, and a will to have a shared agenda. That's what we've been working on for 10 years. We spoke about it yesterday, so I won't go into it now. Why am I so convinced that this is the right way 10 years down the track? Because the challenges of Africa and Europe are shared challenges. We all want peace, prosperity, sovereignty. Europe has always been fighting for this, and after the Second World War, the EU was built on this struggle for peace and sovereignty, and now the European agenda is indeed one built on strategic autonomy so as not to depend on American or Chinese power, and when we want to defend the rule of law, international law, we believe in equality, in equal footing trade relations. We defend the climate. That is what Europe is all about. And that is the exact same challenge that Africa has before it. What Africa wants is peace, prosperity, and independence. And deep down, this partnership that is embodied here in this Africa Forward Summit is a bond between Africa and Europe. This is what France is working for: peace, prosperity, and this strategic independence. It's a very powerful thing, and if we can do this, then it will enable us to reconstruct together a multilateral order that has been thrown into upheaval, been jeopardized, affects all of us, and And deep down, this can be a strong basis for moving forward together. And in terms of peace, I don't want to repeat what President Ruto said. Peace is going to require African unity, and I really firmly believe this. And I'm delighted to see so many of my brothers here, heads of state and government from so many nations who have come to Nairobi. I know that you're all very busy, so I'm very grateful to you for making this, because it really does share this image of a united continent, from Maghreb right down to the Indian Ocean, the south of the continent, Western Africa, Central Africa, and Eastern Africa. Remember, all of these different parts of Africa, given that it is so large, are all part, nonetheless, of one continent with a shared agenda. Which means that if we want to be beside you, it means that we have equal representation, better representation for Africa in international instances such as the UN, the financial institutions, and we want it represented in the Security Council of the UN. As we have also been fighting for for Africa to have a permanent seat at the G20. We've been fighting for this for years, and we've now made it a reality. And we are fighting for an agenda, along with the Secretary General. We've been talking about this for an African UN presence, which will be all the better placed to defend its own peace and security operations, particularly through the UN missions. We hope to see all the wherewithal given to Africa to ensure its own sovereign security. The African continent needs better representation, and Africa has the capacity to build on its strengths. So what we stand ready to do is assist you financing that with a reworked security arrangement, which is respectful of the sovereignty of each African country, but never eclipsing each nation's sovereignty. And I'm delighted to hear from your introductory remarks a moment ago that we can build together a shared agenda to overcome the peace and security challenges that we face, and continue to work together so that the whole of the UN can move forward on a more equitable basis. Prosperity next. With President Ruto, I was discussing this. I think that he is absolutely right when he's talking about the prosperity of the continent. It's clear, it's simple. No, what I'm offering is not to offer assistance. Those days are behind us, and we know that there are budgetary challenges in some instances, security challenges in others. These are realities that we need to be realistic about, but we need to rethink our North-South relations, and we need to look with lucidity at all of the cross-cutting benefits that Africa can derive from its diaspora. Those who are working very, very hard in many, many of our countries and send remittances back home are another important lever that we must not overlook. But the main notion I want to focus on is co-investment. What is co-investment able to achieve? It means investing in human capital, the young talents in Africa, in a formal economy. One of the major difficulties here is too much of the African economies that are underneath the tip of the iceberg as informal economy. It's about time we brought them into the value chains and to structure your agricultural sector and your industrial sector in such a way that it will be stronger than ever, so that Africa will no longer be seen as a place for rare earths and other resources to be extracted, but rather to be a partner. So we are working towards a transformation of investment relations, investing in value chains, energy, sustainable development, building on your strengths and your youth and your talent. And this is what the Business Roundtable is hopefully going to enable us to structure by looking at investing in AI, health, the blue economy, and sustainable agriculture. So what we need to do is look at the partnership that we want together through a logic of investment. And this is where we see this agenda of prosperity and sovereignty altogether. Getting Africa forward on the economic level means greater sovereignty and autonomy. It's important for Europeans as well to have more strategic autonomy in its partnerships. We need to ensure that we do not become dependent on the two major powers who in some ways look like they're going to eclipse everything. And it's not just France and Europe today who are going to mobilize all of the critical minerals or rare earths that we're going to need for the future. It's neither France nor Europe that will be here giving you diktats on the way forward. No. Those days are way behind us. No, the European agenda has every interest in seeing you march strongly towards a sovereignty and autonomy because they're the same goals that we have. And if you are successful in this hunt for sovereignty, be it with agriculture, with economy, or wherever, then you are also offering more solutions to us. So your success is our success. So when you invest in your populations and have them succeed, that means fewer people fleeing poverty. And so this again is our success and your success hand in hand. So here what I want is for all of us to take a leap together. This is not an agenda which is univocal, which is top-down from Europe to Africa. No way. It is an equal footing partnership built on mutual respect. And we're going to build this together with respect, lucidity, and courage. And that is why, if we're going to be successful in this, we need business leaders, and that's what we announced yesterday. And this is a big first, 23 billion euros of investment in the private sector. These are for industry, for firms in the fully private sector companies in Africa. These 23 billion euros of investment is 14 billion for French firms in Africa, 9 billion in investments for African businesses on our continent. On your continent. And so this, we are hoping, will be the jolt that we need to inject more momentum into the process. All of this is going to, as President Ruto said, be based on quite simple things. A new partnership, a new vision for managing resources, for sustainable agriculture, for having tax and financial policies that are more consistent. It's also going to mean that we can mobilize international funding better, be it the World Bank, be it with the IMF and with other international, with special drawing rights, with all kinds of mechanisms and debt restructuring that can move us all forward. So it's a true strategy for guaranteeing peace, and that is why the ITD here in Nairobi is so important. We're going to be able to work with you, with the ATD, so as to move forward so that ATD can play its full role continent-wide, and in this way prove successful. This strategy is a whole new paradigm shift, and it's going to require a new financial paradigm shift. And this is all part of our shared strategy. Other than that, I would say President Ruto said what I wanted to say, that I think this summit embodies our new partnership, and I think he said it better than I ever could. So I want to endorse what he said. In a moment's time, we will be meeting with business leaders, and we'll be discussing growth. We'll be discussing finance and investments, and then after that, we're going to have the outcome of this Africa Forward Summit with the declarations of those investments. And then together with President Ruto, we're going to bring to the G7 in Evian, on behalf of all of you, the message from this forum. And then throughout the year, at the IMF, World Bank, at the UN, we are going to showcase and push this shared agenda. And that is why this summit, in my opinion, is going to enable us to jointly set forward our upcoming path. So I don't want to take up any more of your time, dear ladies and gentlemen, but I just wanted to extend my thanks to President Ruto for agreeing to host this outstanding summit here in Nairobi. And I'm delighted to be here with you, with my brothers and sisters from all around Africa. And I'm looking forward to working on all of the input that we can pool, your strengths, your energy, so that we have a new African-French partnership. This agenda for peace and prosperity is something that I truly aspire to. And it's something that, with a lot of respect and humility, that I want to put at the service of this continent, the world's youngest continent. And even last year, we had the strongest rate of growth from around the world. So it's not only the continent of the future, it's already a power and a strength in the world today. And I am proud to be standing at your side and to try humbly to build with you this agenda in which we will be investing heavily. We want to work with you. Long live friendship between Africa and France. Thank you.
A warm, big round of applause for His Excellency. Thank you, Mr. President, for reinforcing the shared opportunities between Africa and France to continue working together. And now I'd like to please welcome on stage one of the world's foremost champions of multilateralism, peace and security, sustainable development, and global solidarity. Please welcome to the stage His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations. Welcome, Your Excellency.
President William Ruto, President Emmanuel Macron, congratulations. Congratulations for convening this Africa Forward Summit, and congratulations for forging this renewed partnership between France and Africa for African development. Your Majesty, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the name of this summit captures the moment and the mission: Africa Forward. Forward through one of the most turbulent global moments in living memory. Africa is not waiting. Africa is moving, and Africa is leading. African continents are driving one of the defining debates of our time on how to reform a global financial architecture designed in 1945 for a world that no longer exists. Africa played a leading role in the approval of the Pact of the Future by the General Assembly of the United Nations. It is African leadership building new tools like the Borrowers' Platform, and so that the countries can speak as one and negotiate from strengths. Challenging the credit rating systems that locks too many of the borrowing tools they need. Africa has had a leadership in securing the Seville commitment to expand the lending power of multilateral development banks, to mobilize private capital at scale, and to deliver relief from the debt burden crushing developing economies. It is African leadership through the African Development Bank that is advancing a bold vision to reform the continental's financial architecture from within, mobilizing African resources for African priorities and prosperity. Africa is driving a UN framework convention on international tax cooperation so that countries are no longer cheated out of what is what is rightfully theirs. And I want to praise the African leaders that have understood that it's absolutely essential also to do everything with the adequate policies and strategies to mobilize a much stronger share of national resources in order to be able to accelerate the development of the continent. And it is African leadership, alongside the small island states and other developing countries on the front lines, that has placed the climate emergency where it belongs, at the center of the global agenda. This is not a continent waiting for solutions, this is a continent producing them. But let us be honest about what stands in Africa's way. A global system designed without Africa and still largely operating without Africa, perpetuating century-old injustices. A continent of more than 1.5 billion people with no permanent seats on the UN Security Council, as was referred by President William Ruto. Without the voice, the representation and decision-making power it deserves inside the international financial institutions that shape this economy, it's not Africa that loses, it's the world that loses the fact that the voice of Africa is not conveniently taken into account. Meanwhile, as we all know, official development assistance is collapsing. Aid budgets cut, partnerships unwound, commitments walked back just as the need is greatest. So this is not only a financial crisis, this is a crisis of solidarity. Take climate change. Africa did not cause it, yet the continent is warming faster than the global average, bearing the harshest consequences in displaced communities, lost harvests, and economic shocks. Today's global energy turmoil, volatile fossil fuel markets, fragmented trade, is deepening fiscal stress, inflation, and stunted development across the continent. Africa must be at the center of climate justice. The continent holds 60% of the world's best solar potential and receives 2% of global clean energy investments. With the right finance, Africa could generate 10 times more electricity than it needs by 2040 entirely from renewables. Yet, 600 million Africans still live without electricity. And 1 billion still rely on unclean cooking, a crisis that takes 800,000 lives a year, mostly women and children, mostly out of sight. And on average, the continent faces borrowing costs twice as high as OECD countries as an average, draining resources that should be building the future. That is not a market verdict on Africa. It is a verdict on the injustices of the system. The continent also holds extraordinary reserves of the critical minerals the green transition depends on. For too long, the pattern has been the same. Africa's resources have been extracted, the value captured elsewhere, the environmental damage left behind. The United Nations panel on critical energy transitions minerals points the way. Fair value chains, in-country processing and manufacturing, transparency, environmental and human rights standards, and meaningful benefits for affected communities. No more exploitation, no more plundering. The people of Africa must benefit first and most from the resources of Africa. And going back to climate change, adaptation must no longer be an afterthought. The adaptation finance gap must be closed. Africa is paying an enormous price in relation to the devastation caused by climate change, and Africa has been denied the resources and the capacities able to protect their populations and their infrastructure in these circumstances. Climate finance with justice is a must in today's world. Excellence.
Excellencies, this summit is about a new partnership which has been reinvented. Partnership on an equal footing, based on complementarity and mutual benefits. This means that we must co-invest in industries that have been created by Africans. Strengthening universities and African research institutions, developing African capacities in terms of artificial intelligence so that AI can be shaped by African data, African languages, African researchers, and African leadership. Building partnerships which are built on the roadmaps of Africa, the free trade areas in Africa, the Agenda 2063, and the national development priorities. And this means funding African priorities with fair conditions for all, with capital that is accessible. The biggest transformation of this century is not a market but a generation. And by 2050, 1 out of 4 people on the planet will be African.
Jana katika
do rosto da nueva alianza.
في كل مكان في هذه القارة الذين
cultivating and they are asking for inclusive democratic governance and responsible institutions. Dear friends, the continent is not just an African challenge. When Africa succeeds, the entire world wins. Systems and partnerships built on mutual respect. Together, let us move forward with Africa, with trust, solidarity, and the hope of a shared future. Thank you very much.
Another big round of applause for His Excellency. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to welcome our next speaker, who is a distinguished African diplomat, currently leading Africa's premier continental institution. He's a steadfast champion of continental integration and multilateral cooperation. Please welcome the African Union Commission.
Monsieur William Ruto, Président de la République du Kenya. Excellence, Monsieur Emmanuel Macron, Président de la République française, co-initiateur du sommet Africa Forward. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement. Excellences, Monsieur le Secrétaire général des Nations Unies, Mesdames et Messieurs. D'emblée, j'aimerais adresser nos remerciements au Kenya pour l'accueil de cet important événement. À travers cette rencontre, le Kenya et la France souhaitent impulser à l'Afrique une dynamique de progrès. En effet, l'Afrique doit se positionner pour peser sur les décisions globales. La géopolitique internationale est perturbée. L'économie mondiale vacille. Le multilatéralisme et la sécurité collective sont remises en question. Dans ce contexte incertain, notre continent se doit d'être aux avant-postes de l'alternance. Il est indéniable que l'Afrique possède des atouts majeurs. Démographie et jeunesse, terres et ressources minières, énergie renouvelable et hydrocarbures. En effet, transformer le continent résidentiel.
The transformation of these assets into advantages, diversifying our economy. This is part of the recipe for success. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is possible to develop technology at a lower cost to train young people and our women. Energy will be the major factor. The competitiveness of our economy will require affordable capital. It is estimated that $690 billion with 80 billion of illicit financial flows and 115 billion in annual additional costs.
Parfaitement ces défis. Les solutions viendront de la cohérence de nos politiques, de l'engagement sans réserve de nos États membres et de la stabilité à travers le continent. Les institutions multilatérales sont appelées à être proactives.
More balanced partnerships and the cost of development are fundamental principles of global governance. Africa stands ready to take on greater responsibility on the international stage and in particular in the global south. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, peace and stability are an important challenge on the continent. Security must no longer be an obstacle to investment on our continent. It is therefore imperative to ensure that we do this without hesitation. The African Union Commission has made this an absolute priority.
It has become irrelevant when I listened to our presidents here, in particular President Ruto. He touched upon all the issues I wanted to raise, but let me conclude my very brief remark by saying this. The future is for the African continent. The African continent will be the powerhouse of global growth. So let us work together, let us put our energies together and move forward. And I thank you.
Your Excellencies, please allow me to briefly highlight the high-level roundtable discussions that will continue throughout the day. Immediately following the opening session, we'll proceed to the high-level plenary on energy transition and green industrialization in the adjacent room, Savo B. It's just right next. This will be followed by a high-level working lunch session on the reform of the international financial architecture, Savo C. Following the lunch working session will be a plenary on peace and security. Thereafter, we will then transition into parallel roundtable discussions on artificial intelligence and digital technologies, blue economy, health, and agriculture. In parallel, there will also be a special session on Congo Basin Climate Commission ahead of the closing ceremony. To ensure the smooth flow of the summit proceedings, members of the organizing team will be available throughout the venue to provide guidance. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause to our open plenary speakers. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. God bless Kenya. God bless Africa. God bless France. Asanteni sana. Allow me to hand over to Mr. Mike Gitonga.
Thank you, Vivian. Let's give a clap for Vivian for great moderation. Your Excellencies, that brings us to the end of this session and would like to now invite all the presidents and heads of state to a family photo, which we're going to take right here on stage. So I'll kindly request that all the Excellencies for a family photo before we exit. All presidents and heads of state to kindly just be here on stage for a family photo.